Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first online London lecture of the spring term. My name is Mark Searcy, and I'm the Pro Vice-Chancellor for Science at the University of East Anglia. Tonight's speaker is Charlie Wilson, a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at UEA and researcher in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. But before we hear from Professor Wilson on his research, I'd like to give you a brief update on recent happenings at UEA. Robert Nichols, Director of the Tyndall Centre and Professor of Climate Adaptation in UEA's School of Environmental Sciences, has just released findings which indicate that climate change, combined with human-caused land subsidence, is causing sea levels to rise higher than had previously been anticipated for the world's coastal residents. While some factors contributing to the fall or rise of the Earth's coastlines are beyond human control, activities such as oil and gas extraction and the construction of flood barriers around rivers can cause ground to sink. The team found that the problems are compounded by the fact that coastal inhabitants are often concentrated in subsiding areas. The problem of subsidence and its effects on sea level rises is well documented for certain regions, but the study by Robert and his colleagues has brought together data to provide a worldwide scope of the issue for the first time. UEA's Climate of Change campaign launched in November to empower young people and the wider community to speak up and share their concerns and ideas for the future. The hope is to draw attention to grassroots solutions to climate change and help answer the most urgent questions surrounding key issues. UEA continues to be a global leader in climate science, collaborating with leading international institutions. The 26th meeting of COP, the Conference of the Parties, will take place in the UK in Glasgow in November. This global climate event, organised by the United Nations and attended by political leaders from all over the world, can lead to real change. While UEA reported the good news of a dip in emissions due to lockdown in 2020, the bad news is that they're on the rise again, and the level of CO2 in the atmosphere continues to increase. UEA is launching a programme of workshops, teaching resources and events to engage young people in climate change in the run-up to COP26. The youth campaign will reach out beyond the East Anglian region, drawing on UEA's position as a leader in climate change research and empowering young people to become part of the climate change conversation. COP26 and the Climate of Change campaign coincide with the 21st anniversary of the Tyndall Centre, of which UEA is a core partner. A new podcast series, Tyndall Talks, promises to untangle questions and discussions on climate science and climate policies. You can tune in to the series on Spotify, iTunes, and Amazon Music. In other event news, a new series of free politics talks begins next month. After Brexit, Utopia or Dystopia has been curated by Hussein Kassim, Professor of Politics at UEA and Senior Fellow of UK in a Changing Europe. The series will give an opportunity for leading figures from politics and academia to share their reflections and offer their hopes and fears for the future. Next week is also the final event in this season of UEA's Philosophy Public Lecture Series and is entitled, Can We Adapt Transformatively to Climate Decline? But now back to this evening's talk. We're fortunate to be able to share with you Professor Charlie Wilson's research today, even if we can't all be together in person just yet. Charlie Wilson joined the Tyndall Centre and UEA in September 2010 from the London School of Economics, where he was a teaching fellow. He has a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Canada on the social and behavioural determinants of energy use. Charlie came to academia somewhat late. Prior to his PhD, he worked for a number of years in the private sector in both renewable energy finance and climate change policy. Since then, Charlie has worked on various international assessments, including the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the Global Energy Assessment, and the Exponential Carbon Roadmap. He has co-authored 2 books, one on energy innovation and one on smart technologies, and he regularly advises international bodies, including Mission Innovation and the International Energy Agency. Tonight, Charlie will explore the ways in which digitalisation is changing how we move, shop, interact, and manage life at home, and the impact this is having on carbon emissions, for better and for worse. He will argue that digitalisation can help us make progress towards net zero emission targets, but only if it's steered in that direction by public policy. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Charlie Wilson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Just to check, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thank you all for joining digitally this evening. I'm going to be talking about whether the relationship between our digital future and our low carbon future. And digitalization and climate change are two of the dominant forces that will shape our lives over the coming decades. This is not me saying this is the argument of a whole series of recent studies by the United Nations, by the Royal Society here in the UK, by the Advisory Council on Global Change to the German government, and many others. In his recent book, Bill Gates rightly called climate change the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. And it's fitting, for the purposes of my talk, that this quote comes from one of the pioneers of the digital age. I'll be using the term digitalization a lot. So what do I mean by it? Essentially, digitalization means data. Lots and lots and lots of data. Collecting, exchanging, storing and analyzing data. Very cheaply, very quickly, very interconnectedly. By some estimates, there are over 20 billion devices currently connected and exchanging data over the internet. And over the past 2 years alone, such devices have churned out 90% of the data ever produced. My colleagues Caroline Zim and Arnulf Grubler have found that the mobile phone is one of the most equitably distributed technologies worldwide in history. Currently, almost 5 billion people use the internet, which is approaching 2/3 of the world's population. And as you can see in this graphic, successive generations of digital technologies, moving from left to right, are taking ever shorter times to spread, in this case to reach 1 billion users. And of course, COVID and the lockdowns have dramatically accelerated this digitalization of our daily lives in many ways. The increase in demands on our digital networks as we went into lockdowns was enormous. I've seen estimates from 30% to over 100% increases in data traffic as schooling, working, checking in with families and friends, shopping, gaming, and even puffing and panting our way through fitness classes all went online. Imagine if we increased demand by 30% practically overnight on our road networks, on our rail networks, on our power or gas or water networks. They would all have collapsed. Apart from a few frozen Zoom screens and slow loading web pages, in general, the broadband and mobile networks were able to handle data, much more data. Now, although I'm singing the praises of our resilient data infrastructure, I'm currently locked down a few miles from Land's End at the tip of Cornwall, where my family's from. The pasties are excellent, but the broadband speeds are not the best. So if I glitch or start sounding a bit robotic, then our digital networks clearly still have room for improvement. Now, how the digitalization of our daily lives will affect climate change is highly uncertain. Tackling climate change means cutting our carbon emissions by half over the next decade and to almost zero by 2050. But as the graph on the left shows, emissions are still rising, notwithstanding last year's COVID blip. To get that curve coming down rapidly, we need to transform how we generate electricity, how we fuel our cars and planes, how we produce steel and cement, and other things besides. This is inescapably, as you see on the right, to do with our daily lives. If you attribute all the carbon emissions to the goods and services they ultimately provide us with, then around 3/4 of all carbon emissions are linked to our daily activity. It's this that makes climate change such an intractable problem. Our lives are deeply energetic, and over 80% of that energy still comes from burning fossil fuels. So carbon emissions keep rising. Now, here's a different way of showing the full picture of where our carbon emissions come from. And it's a very complex picture, which is not surprising because it tries to capture the entire global energy and resource system in one go. So let me walk you through it. Start on the left. You'll see the useful services or activities that make up our daily lives, from lighting and washing to cooling and getting around. Next to them, in the pinkish column, you'll see the devices and technologies we use to provide us with those services. Those devices, in turn, use energy and resources ultimately extracted from nature. So follow the horizontal lines over to the right. They connect to the renewable energies at the top, to the fossil fuels in the middle, and to the crops we grow and the minerals we mine at the bottom. Now, digital technologies can impact all parts of this picture. And I want to group the impacts on our carbon emissions into 3 types. The first are impacts on direct emissions, which we cause by combusting fossil fuels, the natural gas in our boilers to heat our homes, or the petrol in our cars to move us around. The second kind of impacts are on indirect emissions, which we cause by using energy whose production involves combusting fossil fuels, the main example being electricity. And then there are impacts on embodied emissions, which we cause by owning, using, consuming things, stuff, anything from appliances and devices to clothes and food, anything physical, including our own homes, whose production or manufacture involves combusting fossil fuels or otherwise releasing carbon. So, will digitalization help or hinder our efforts to tackle climate change? It's very common to read predictions of polar opposites, digital heaven or hell, digital dystopia or utopia, or more aptly for climate change, digitalization as a fire retardant or a fire accelerant. Where do you think digitalization sits on these scales? Would you tip towards digital utopia, putting out the fires of climate change? Do you see digitalization as an abundance of data harnessed for the benefit of all, to monitor, to learn, to optimize, to control, and ultimately to reduce our carbon emissions? Or would you tip more towards digital dystopia, pouring fuel on our warming planet? Do you see digitalization as a deluge of throwaway gadgets, drawing on energy-hungry data infrastructure alongside the threat of mass surveillance? It may help you think this through to know that digitalization is much like the Force. It's everywhere, it's pervasive. You need skills to use it. It takes time and patience to learn those skills, but once you have them, the Force can be used for great good or great evil. If you don't understand what I mean by the Force, and you don't recognize either of these copyright-free images of world-renowned Star Wars characters, Yoda and Darth Vader, then don't worry. All you need to know is that green is good and red is bad, like a traffic light if you're in a rush. Now, I should confess at this point that despite being a sci-fi fan, I'm something of a technological laggard. I came to the smartphone only fairly recently, and I still just about manage to function in today's world without using any social media. I say this in case you think I'm wedded to some techno-utopian vision. I'm really not. I like to think that being fairly technologically naive makes me a good independent observer. But while fairly agnostic about technology, I am deeply passionate about climate. So I want to talk now about the opportunities of climate change, the opportunities for climate change of digitalization. And then I'll come back later to talk about the risks. So there are 7 reasons why I think the digitalization of our daily lives can help reduce carbon emissions. And the first is that digital alternatives to physical activities can have much lower carbon footprints if they are direct substitutes. Now, lockdowns have made the most obvious example of this physical to digital substitution even more obvious. Teleworking or remote working as a substitute for physical commuting, and video conferencing as a substitute for physical travel to meetings, conferences, or even public lectures by UEA profs. A recent review of the evidence by Steve Sorrell and colleagues at the University of Sussex found teleworking reduces the amount we travel by up to 20% or so, with knock-on benefits for congestion and carbon emissions. Another substitution effect is e-commerce or online shopping, cutting out one leg of the journey from home to shop and back to home. Evidence shows that with well-designed distribution operations and delivery routes, e-commerce can help reduce carbon emissions if it substitutes for us driving. And e-commerce doesn't just have to mean big brands like Amazon. My colleague at UEA, Mark Wilson, who's no relation, is researching digital food hubs, which are like online farmers markets. They provide a platform for lots of local suppliers to sell direct to consumers. So rather than a veggie box with too many turnips each week, consumers can do their full weekly food shops that they would otherwise do in a supermarket. So that's reductions in direct carbon emissions, less fuel for driving. Now, moving from a consumer culture of owning to one of accessing can also help reduce emissions. We own, or we used to own, countless single-purpose goods, from CD players and DVD players to GPS units and cameras. Have a look at all those goods on the right. How many do you still own? How many do you still use? The functionality provided by those goods, listening to music, watching movies, getting unlost and taking selfies, can all now be provided digitally. Devices like the smartphone on the left have become portals through to this ever-expanding world of digital service provision. Now, what if we moved from the world of owning stuff on the right to the world of accessing services on the left? Have a look at the size of the circles underneath. Accessing services digitally could see up to a 90-fold reduction in power while in use. Compare the size of the blue circle on the left with the blue circle on the right. Accessing services digitally could see a 30-fold reduction in power while on standby, that's the green circles. A 25-fold reduction in embodied energy, that's the red circles. And a 250-fold reduction in weight, that's the grey circles. So that means reductions in both indirect carbon emissions, less electricity, and embodied carbon emissions, less stuff. Now, at this stage, these savings are more of a potential than a reality. Many physical goods remain necessary or desirable as objects of beauty, of status, of memory, or just as clutter that we're still oddly rather attached to. But their role as the sole providers of functionality in our daily lives is changing, and digitalization offers more and more opportunities to dematerialize. Now, where this idea of accessing services rather than owning goods really comes to a head is in our relationship with our cars. After our homes, these are the second most expensive thing we're ever likely or fortunate enough to buy. And yet they sit doing nothing for 90 or 95% of the time. When we do drive them, we're most likely to be on our own in the car. We love our cars. Indeed, transport-related carbon emissions in the UK are still rising. We're buying more and more SUVs, and we're driving more than ever. Now here, digitalisation makes things really interesting as it solves the coordination problem of how to match up all that spare capacity of cars sitting idle or cars being driven half empty with all those needing cars or rides. This in turn enables service-based alternatives to owning and driving your own car, like car clubs, lift sharing, ride sharing, and the one I'm really excited about, which is called shared ride hailing. Uber is a ride hailing platform that essentially offers a private taxi service. A driver picks you up and takes you where you want to go. Shared ride hailing involves multiple pickups and multiple drop-offs for multiple occupants, with the route being dynamically adjusted to meet the needs of those in the vehicle at any given time. It combines the occupancy of a bus with the flexibility of a taxi, hence its other name, the taxi bus. Studies by the International Transport Forum, a sister organisation to the OECD, have shown that coordinating these shared modes through digital platforms can deliver the same amount of mobility using a fraction of the vehicle fleet, with enormous benefits for congestion, for air quality, and all that liberated road and parking space that we can do other more interesting things with instead. So that's reductions in direct carbon emissions, less driving, and embodied carbon emissions, fewer cars, all because digital technology can solve the coordination problem. The challenge is not technological, but social. Are we willing to trade in the personal autonomy and ease of driving our own big car? Exchanging digital information about surplus supply and unmet demand can help in other ways too. There are lots of digital platforms like eBay that enable us to exchange rather than stockpile our stuff. Exchange also helps avoid waste. Take food as an example. Agriculture accounts for a fifth or more of global greenhouse gas emissions, and around 1/3 of the food produced globally is wasted or lost on its journey from farm to mouth, where it serves its useful function as nutrition. Again, digitalization can help. Real-time data flows can connect consumers who want food with wholesalers, supermarkets, cafes, and restaurants with surplus food that would otherwise be thrown away. So that's reductions in embodied carbon emissions, less food grown and less stuff made unnecessarily. Digital technologies can also provide us with more control over how we use energy, for example. Take smart heating. About 2/3 of the energy we use in our homes is for heating. We tend to underestimate this share of our energy use as it's literally invisible and on in the background. But reducing the energy we use to heat our homes is one of the major challenges for climate change. Smart heating controls, or smart thermostats, enable us to control our heating more easily, more instantaneously, more zonally, and more remotely. Data flowing between these devices and giant data crunching algorithms in the cloud also mean our heating can be controlled for us. For example, by adjusting the thermostat down if the outdoor air temperature rises, if our homes are unoccupied, or if we're trying to save money on our bills, and we configure our smart heating controls to help us. How would you feel about that? A digital technology helping control your carbon emissions. My colleague Tom Hargreaves at UEA and I found that early adopting households with smart technology sometimes felt out of control as a result of all the new ways they were able to be in control of their domestic environment. A trial run by the government's Behavioural Insights team, known informally as the Nudge Unit, found that smart heating controls, like the Nest shown here, saved up to 7% of energy used for heating. This is important. So, reductions in direct carbon emissions, less gas burnt in our boilers. Now, the app icon on the top right-hand side of this slide is, of course, the electric vehicle. We all need to be driving them within a decade or so if we want to meet our climate targets. What happens when 5, 10 or 15 million electric vehicles get home in the evening and plug in at the same time to recharge? Huge spikes in electricity demand that can only be met by drawing on fossil-fueled power plants. 30 years ago, there was a small number of large power plants in the UK sending electricity out through transmission grids to the millions of households, shops and firms who use the power to cook, to light, to communicate and to fritter away time on YouTube. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of power plants, most of them very small scale, solar panels on our roofs, wind turbines in our nearby fields. In 20 years' time, when the UK's vehicle fleet is fully electric, there will be tens of millions of power plants. This is good for carbon emissions. Electricity can be readily decarbonised, whereas gas in boilers or petrol in cars cannot. But it poses a massive integration challenge. Now imagine that all those electric vehicles, when plugged in, can exchange data with the electricity networks so that they integrate and become a part of those networks. In times of surplus power, in the depths of the night, for example, when the wind is blowing, vehicle batteries get recharged. But in times of power shortages, cold winter evenings, the vehicle batteries actually send power to the grid. The country's vehicle fleet then acts like an enormous zero carbon power station, thanks to digitalisation. A final benefit of digitalisation is that it enables carbon emissions to be tracked. Imagine if all the carbon emitting activity on the right could be tracked all the way down through the supply chains to the goods and services in our daily lives on the left. Full transparency about which products and which firms are accountable for how many emissions, where and when. This in turn would enable consumers to vote with their wallets, shareholders to vote with their investments, and digital technology users to vote with their swiping and app downloading, targeting high carbon offenders and supporting low carbon alternatives. So putting this together, here's a summary of these ways in which digitalisation of our daily lives can potentially help reduce emissions. And you can see that different mechanisms impact different types of emission. Some help reduce our direct carbon emissions from combusting fossil fuels. So less gas for heating our homes, less petrol for driving our cars. Some help reduce our indirect carbon emissions from the electricity generated in turn by combusting fossil fuels. And some mechanisms help reduce our embodied emissions by helping us reduce the amount of manufactured stuff in our lives or our wastage of things like food. We've also seen how digital technologies have wider system benefits. They enable a low carbon transportation system. They enable a renewable electricity system, and they enable a lower waste and potentially more localized food system. But so far, this has been a very one-sided story. It's time now to turn to the dark side. Remember the smart heating controls? Well, my colleague Phil Grunewald at Oxford has shown that households with cats use on average 13% more energy than comparable households without cats. And for all you dog owners out there, households with dogs use on average 16% more energy than comparable households without dogs. We like to keep our homes warm for our moggies and pooches. And smart heating controls could potentially make this even easier. So as the red Darth Vader here symbolizes, digitalization can cause emissions to go up as well as down. Now, there are four main risks for climate change of the digitalization in our daily lives that I want to talk to you about. The first is called rebound. In a digital context, rebound means that if a digital technology makes something easier or cheaper, we'll do more of it. More teleworking may lead to us having more devices to run our home offices, and they will use more electricity. Rebound effect. An app that makes it easy for us to control our heating through our phones while at work may mean we'll turn the heating on by remote to keep our beloved pet warm. Rebound effect. There are much more extreme examples of rebound. Take autonomous vehicles. If these take hold, the cost and convenience of travel by car could become much, much more attractive, with all the time spent stuck behind the wheel now freed up to work, to sleep, to check Twitter, or to watch movies while moving around town. One study by UEA London at the University of Leeds anticipated a possible 60% increase in energy use from vehicles due to this rebound effect, driving around more in autonomous vehicles. Should we be worried about these rebound effects? In recent work with my colleagues at UEA, we've looked at hundreds of studies that quantified the emission impacts of over 30 different digital technologies and services. You've seen many of these already in the app icons that I've been showing on some of the earlier slides. We did find some evidence of potential rebound effects in a handful of cases that meant carbon emissions went up rather than down, and the autonomous vehicle was one of those examples. But in general, we found that rebound effects offsetted some portion of the carbon benefits of digital technologies, but not all. Now, rebound is a example of a broader phenomenon that I call energy intensification. We humans continue to demonstrate staggering ingenuity in coming up with new ways of unnecessarily using energy. The favourite example in the 1990s when I started working on climate change was the electric can opener. Now, thanks to digitalization, it's the smart toothbrush. And what about our addiction to digital services like email or Netflix? Are cat videos causing a climate change nightmare, as this Reuters headline suggests? Well, researchers at the International Energy Agency recently debunked some of the more outlandish claims being made. So the bars on this graph show the carbon emitted from streaming half an hour of video. It factors in the electricity used by the devices in our home and the data infrastructure that stores and sends data to those devices in the form of the latest David Attenborough documentary or whatever takes your viewing pleasure. On this graph, you'll see some very small bars at the top. These are the estimates from the International Energy Agency. The very large bars in the middle are widely cited, yet completely over the top estimates from other sources. At the bottom, you'll see two comparison points, boiling a kettle and driving 5 kilometers. So the next time you're fretting about the carbon footprint from your Netflix habit, just avoid a round trip to the shops in your car instead. Now, this is not to make light of our increased dependence on energy using digital infrastructure. But so far, we've managed to more or less keep a lid on the carbon footprint of this digital infrastructure. Despite the demands on our data networks increasing exponentially over the last decade, that's shown on the graph on the left, the electricity consumption of the data centers and server farms that are the hardware behind cloud computing and much of the internet, has actually stayed fairly flat. That's the graph on the right. This is partly due to efficiency gains and partly due to economies of scale as the data centers get ever larger. All the electricity used by all the world's digital infrastructure accounts for about 1% of total global electricity. At least in the near future, it's not expected to rise even as data flows continue to grow. Remember also that electricity that powers these data flows and our devices can also be generated from low carbon renewables. But we are a long way off having a surplus of low carbon electricity. So we have to avoid intensifying our use of unnecessarily energy hungry digital applications. Now, rising distrust could also undermine the potential benefits of digitalization for climate change. According to the Harvard Law Review, recent inventions and business methods call attention to the next step which must be taken for the protection of the person and for securing the right to be let alone. You would be forgiven for thinking this may be about smart meters or some other digital devilry being forced upon us. But it's actually from an influential article published over a century ago in 1890. If I'd included the next sentence, you might have guessed. The authors go on to say, instantaneous photographs have invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life, and numerous mechanical devices threaten to make good the prediction that what is whispered in the closet shall be proclaimed from the housetops. I should really have done that in an American accent, but I'll spare you. In the late 18th century, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham theorized the Panopticon as an institutional building in which all prisoners could be surveilled by a single security guard without being able to tell they were being watched. It's nothing new for us to be concerned about surveillance, privacy, trust, and how these are regulated. But digitalization has changed the game in terms of the quantity and type of data available, as well as how easily it can be harvested, shared, and misused. Remember your electric vehicle exchanging data with the grid? Remember you finding rides with other vehicle users? Remember you exchanging data with your smart heating provider? Free flows of data are only possible if we trust how it's collected, used, analysed, and applied. Rising distrust could undermine the potential benefits of digitalisation for climate change. Is this happening already? Well, it's hard to detect any dents in the popularity of technology companies, despite the succession of scandals or revelations about surveillance. Remember Edward Snowden in 2013, or about the misuse of personal information. Remember Cambridge Analytica in 2018. So far, trust still seems largely intact, but this absolutely cannot be taken for granted. A different risk that could undermine the potential benefits of digitalization for climate change is a deepening digital divide. The enforced home working, homeschooling, and online shopping from COVID has held a magnifying glass up to this digital divide. Now, the UK fares well relative to your other European countries in terms of access to digital infrastructure. If you look at the map on the left, the darker red regions are those where over 90% of the adult population are daily internet users. But within the UK, as you see on the map on the right, there are still significant pockets of people who lack basic digital skills, like being able to send emails or go to websites. These people are also disproportionately elderly, and they tend to lack access to the internet at home and don't own a smartphone or PC. The benefits of digitalization for climate change need to be accessible to all. Now, these dark sides to digitalization, rebound, intensification, distrust, and the digital divide could all erode or even worsen the impact of digital technologies on our carbon emissions. In other words, like the force, digitalization can be used for good or for ill. Not good in the Star Wars sense of a benevolent cosmic order, but good in the still very important sense of a low carbon future and an inhabitable planet. Where do you think the balance will fall? Have I tipped you more towards a digital utopia or more towards digitalization pouring fuel on the flames? Ultimately, I think where the balance will fall depends on what we all do, governments, firms, and us. So firstly, policies and regulations on climate change and on digitalization have been running so far in parallel. They need to be aligned. Government action on digitalization has focused so far on issues of privacy, security, and safety, on issues of taxation, and on jobs, skills, and infrastructure. All critically important, but none explicitly about climate change. Beneficial impacts on carbon emissions need to be written into digital strategies, support for the digital industries, digital innovation, and digital regulation. The Royal Society report in the middle proposed an energy proportionality test. Energy consumption or carbon emissions from digital technologies should be proportional to their societal benefit. Energy hungry new applications that push emissions up with little or no public benefit, no longer possible. There are also many initiatives involving the digital industries. Sustainability in the Digital Age is a coalition of scientific and research organisations working with digital and technology companies. In their manifesto, they call for a new social contract for the digital age. This captures the idea that companies need to earn and sustain the trust of those that use their products and services by meeting certain expectations or standards of practice. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't exploit the vulnerable, don't be evil. But what about don't make climate change worse, or even help tackle climate change? Imagine if your favorite search engine included carbon emissions in their algorithms that decide what hits you get shown first. You're looking to travel from A to B, you're looking to buy a new washing machine. The options you first see are the best in class for reducing carbon emissions. Not only would this be a huge influence on our choices, but also a huge incentive for companies to get on top of tracking, reporting, and reducing their own emissions. Finally, there's us. And here's 4 final verbs for you. Firstly, we can think. Our daily lives are inextricably linked to energy use and burning fossil fuels. Anything you can do to reduce carbon emissions is a step in the right direction. Could digital technology help? Digitalization may not work for you on a personal level, but are there shared benefits that you could contribute to through your data? Secondly, we can experiment. I admitted at the beginning to being something of a technological laggard, and I really am. But over the past few years, I've been pushing myself to try out digitally enabled services like meal kits, electric bike sharing, and smart heating. It's been surprisingly fun and has certainly shaped my own behaviour. Try something out, see if it works for you. Thirdly, we can resist. Don't let your trust in flows of data for public good be eroded. If it worries you, complain, lobby, support data protection or open data services. Help build and enforce a social contract between digital service providers and us as users, in which carbon emissions are prioritised. And fourthly, and finally, we can adapt. In this black and white photo, the lettering, if you look hard on the cart, says Standard Oil. This is a horse delivering an oil tank to a filling station in order to fuel a car, which would go on in about 15 years to entirely substitute for the horse as a means of transportation around the beginning of last century. We're in the same phase of substitution between the digital and the physical worlds. As new substitutes for old, it takes time to work out new norms, new expectations, new modes of behaviour. And this last year of lockdowns and restrictions have forced digitalisation upon us with insufficient time to properly adapt. But I think we can. Finally, as a researcher, I'm duty bound to point out that we don't know all the answers. My own research over the coming years will be trying to understand more about how these various forces towards both the light and the dark side of digitalisation play out in our everyday lives. It's also really important to remember that in this talk, I've really been focused on digitalisation in our daily lives and how it might impact carbon emissions. There are many, many other ways digitalisation can impact us, our jobs, our economies, our health, our social lives. And of course, there are also many, many other ways we can reduce carbon emissions. This is a big, big topic, and I've only scratched the surface tonight. So to end where I began, the straight answer to this question, is a digital future also a low carbon future, is actually very simple. It has to be. I cannot see a future in which digitalisation does not become more deeply entwined in our daily lives. And I refuse to see a future in which our carbon emissions keep rising and climate change brings misery to life around the world. Digitalisation is so pervasive a technological and social force, linked or potentially linked with almost any carbon emitting activity, that it's inescapably central to the story of our future. Ensuring digitalisation helps us tackle climate change requires more active government and a collective sense of direction and purpose from digital technology providers and us users alike. And this purpose should emphasise not just our data in return for their services, but also the public good of reduced carbon emissions. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Charlie. That was excellent presentation. A huge amount of food for thought there. It's amazing to think. I mean, as a fellow kind of sci-fi watcher, it's amazing to think that we smile at things like Back to the Future with its vision of what it was going to be like in a few years' time. And yet we never could have imagined that 5 billion people would be using the internet by now, and that our lives would be so controlled by the digital. And I think you gave a really nice explanation, a lot of ideas about how digitalization. I don't think we think a lot of the time about the connection between the climate and digitalization and the ways that we can actually make a difference to things. So that was really excellent. I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions, and actually it'd be really nice for you to come back in a couple of years' time and tell us how things have changed and how things have developed. So before we move on to the question and answer, I'd like to make a small request of you all. We'll email everyone who has registered for tonight's event with a link to a short evaluation survey. We'd be very grateful if you would take a few minutes to complete the survey, and that will help us plan for future events, both online and in person, and for Charlie to come back in a couple of years' time. We now have got the opportunity for you to ask Charlie any questions you might have. To ask a question, use the Q&A feature. Depending on which device you're on, you'll either find this on the right-hand side or under the small icon with a speech bubble containing a question mark. We may not be able to answer every question, but we'll do our best to pose as many as possible to Charlie before we wrap up. If we do run out of time, don't worry, there'll be an opportunity to continue the discussion over on Facebook. You can find more information in the announcements. I'd just as well, just before we ask the first question, I have to vouch for the fact that Charlie's a bit of a Luddite. When we did the rehearsal yesterday, he couldn't actually log into Teams, so just embarrass him there by telling you that. So I think we have some questions already. There's one here from Callum. With no indication yet of a decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions, is a green future possible under a profit-centered, growth-driven economic system?
Wow. That's quite a, well, obviously that's quite a big question. I mean, I don't know if you're asking that specifically in relation to what some of the things I was talking about tonight with respect to digitalization, or whether you're asking that in a sort of much broader sense. I would say that the jury is still, I think, very much out on that question. And it's also a question that very much polarizes the sort of academic and research community that I'm part of. Personally, I do think it's possible to reach our net zero targets, for example, to reach net zero emissions in the UK by 2050 without needing or having to overhaul our basic economic system. But it absolutely requires us to introduce and prioritize decarbonisation to a much greater extent than we have to date.
Okay, thanks. Question here about how far do you feel the change, if we make them, should be the responsibility of governments to legislate versus individuals or companies to drive the change? How much change is going to come from us rather than from the government?
It's an interesting question. I've been working on climate change since the 90s. I mean, it's amazing to think that in 92 at the Rio Earth Summit, the world's countries came together and signed the UN framework on a convention on climate change. And in 97, we signed the Kyoto Protocol to try and reduce emissions. And back then, these questions came up about, who should be leading and to what extent should we be, requiring our governments to lead the way. My view that now in 2021, emissions have risen over that last 30-year period, not gone down. And so where we stand now in 2021, we've gone way past the point of saying, you need to go first or governments need to go first. It's absolutely a question of governments and firms and companies and us as individuals, not just as individual consumers, but us as citizens, as voters, as community organizers, as campaigners. We are absolutely all in this together, and we all need to be taking action. So it's not one or the other, it's both and.
So a question for you about Bitcoin, which I don't really understand, but do you have a view on the energy implications of Bitcoin and other blockchain applications? Yes.
I do. In fact, I had a whole section of the talk all about Bitcoin and blockchain, and I took it out because I was worried that to properly explain it would take pretty much half the talk. But I had a rhetorical question, which I think is absolutely along this line. What do Jordan, Argentina, Denmark, and 2 times Scotland all have in common? And the answer is, they're all countries or land masses whose entire electricity system is equivalent to, apparently, what we use mining Bitcoins. So for the uninitiated, Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency, which is only digital. And in order to essentially print this currency, or what's called mining, you need to essentially crack incredibly complex codes, which need massive energy hungry computer centers running for days, weeks, or months in order to do. Hence this enormous electricity consumption. Now, Bitcoin is a digital currency that's attractive mainly because it's a distributed currency system with no central registry. So there's no central bank or finance institution keeping an eye on all the transactions. So it comes from the sort of fairly alternative world of hacking and so on. But it is incredibly energy intensive, very energy intensive. Remember in my talk, I mentioned the Royal Society proportionality test, that new digital applications should have social benefits proportional to their energy footprints. On that test, there's a big question mark about whether digital applications like Bitcoin would be eligible.
Okay. I have a question about 5G. Does he have a point of view about, or do you have a point of view about claims that 5G is less energy hungry per megabit transmitted than other previous wireless networking technologies?
I mean, I'm absolutely not a, to be clear about the limits of my knowledge, I'm not an engineer. I'm kind of, my research is all around humans and our use of technology. So I don't have an informed answer on that question. But maybe to put that question in the context of some of the things I've been talking about this evening, when you have faster and faster data networks, that will allow us to do things quicker, more conveniently, and so on. But the risk also, remember I talked about intensification, the risk also is that it then allows us to do things which we couldn't really do before. So you have both this potential positive effect and this potential negative effect, at least on our carbon emissions. And this is really what my whole talk was about. You've got very much these options for reducing emissions and these options for increasing emissions. And we need to be intentional and purposeful about avoiding the risks and seizing the opportunities with 5G or with any other data infrastructure.
There's another question that kind of touches on that as well. It's about online shopping. So somebody's asking about, and you touched on this a little bit, that shopping online can reduce emissions, but doesn't it also increase our consumption?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, great point. So I talked about e-commerce as a way of substituting for some of the driving that we do. That's a benefit for reducing carbon emissions. But of course, if the world becomes a shop which you can readily access easily and cheaply from easily and quickly from your living room, then maybe we start consuming more. So that would be a classic example of a rebound effect that I talked about as a risk. On balance, the evidence is still a little bit out on this because it's very hard to quantify, to calculate quantitatively the impact on emissions of changes in shopping habits as a result of online shopping. And interestingly, because of what's happened over the last year, we're starting now to have a period pre-COVID and then the COVID period. And if we now go back to a period in which people start going back to the shops, you've actually got quite a nice data series to try and look at the impacts of online shopping on emissions. But the jury's still out as to that net effect.
Right. I was interested as well in the kind of social, the balance between the kind of digital and the social, because we've got all these things that as you mentioned, that we're putting in place that help us from a digital point of view, like the taxis, the taxi buses that you described. But actually, there's a real barrier from a social perspective, isn't there? Really, for using those things and the way we use those things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to how we use our vehicles, that's really where you start noticing these very strong kind of social and cultural norms and expectations that we have around how we use our cars. With my own research group at UEA, we also looked at the effect that the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns had on people who already used those kinds of shared vehicle modes, and also on people who didn't use them but maybe might in the future. And as you might expect, with all of the sort of issues we've been having around physical distancing, general propensities to use shared vehicle modes have gone right down. In fact, across a whole class of digital low carbon innovations which we looked at, it was the shared vehicle ones that were have been really hit by the last year's worth of experience. So on top of all our social and cultural norms about vehicle use, we've now also got this additional effect of actually not wanting to share confined spaces with strangers. So this will absolutely take time.
So a quick, just I guess just to finish off, there's a question here of what do you think we can expect from COP26?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for those not familiar with the COP26 jargon, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and this is the annual meeting of essentially the global community that come together and try and take action on climate change. So 6 years ago now, in 2015 in Paris, COP21, as it was then, made this kind of landmark breakthrough in which countries signed up to try and limit global warming to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, with a more ambitious target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because in that agreement, they built in this 5-year review mechanism, whereby the commitments that countries made in Paris would be reviewed and then ratcheted up. So you have this sort of ever more stringent ratcheting of emission reduction goals. So COP26, which is going to be in Glasgow in November, should have been last November, but was delayed for a year. And the great hope is that countries around the world actually ratchet up their emission reduction ambition. So that's the sort of the preamble. My direct answer to the question is I see great signs of optimism when it comes to countries' commitments to long-term emission reduction goals. So the UK has a legal target to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. There are a handful of other countries around the world also with legally binding targets, but there are many countries now that have set long-term emission reduction goals to net zero as targets, goals, aspirations, and ambitions. So there's a really nice long-term framework of commitment emerging. The challenge, particularly as we come out of COVID-induced recessions, is in the nearer term, like getting us on near-term progress. And there, I'd say the evidence so far remains, let's say, ambiguous. But I'm an optimist. I think working on climate change, you have to be, otherwise it's a tough job. So I'm optimistic that we'll make progress.
Okay, brilliant, Charlie. Thank you very much. It's been really excellent, and really enjoyed hearing you talk. And apparently there's going to be a chance for you to continue your conversation on Facebook. So you can head to the Facebook event discussion using the link they posted in the announcements. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture, there's also a link to sign up for a monthly What's On email newsletter, which will keep you up to date on future public events from UEA. But finally, I just want to thank Charlie one more time, and hope to see you all again at another London lecture in the near future. Thanks again, Charlie.